Schönen guten Morgen, die Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen. So eine Schimmels merci für die Invitation, die mir erlaubt hat, um ein Chiropraktiker zu kommen, um mich auch und ich riechen zu dürfen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I would like to thank you for your invitation, which has allowed me to come again to Prague and to address you, well, a few words to you today. I like to introduce myself with these words in Luxembourgish, not only because it is my mother tongue, but also because I do not want you to think that I'm French. I have got all kinds of versions. Unfortunately, there isn't the time. I can tell you nevertheless, maybe later in the afternoon, who I am, and above all also who I am not, which is at least as important. I'll now try to be as quick as possible. By the way, there exists a link between this gentleman here, Charles IV, and myself, as Charles IV was not only King of Bohemia and the first King of Bohemia to also become Holy Roman Emperor, but he was also a member of the House of Luxembourg. I've got to do two things at the same time, and as I'm a man, that's not easy. Okay. I last gave a talk here in 2010, and Stefan reminded me of it yesterday, and I must confess that it did not go down all that well. Firstly, I had dared to question the motto of the IVG, maximizing the world's potential through guidance, as well as the IVG's insistence on careers guidance having a vital role to play in maintaining a highly qualified and economically viable society, and playing an important part in supporting economic growth and social stability. And I still find it hard today to accept that the prime value of guidance should lie in its contribution to the maintenance of the current status quo at both political and economic levels. I was also very angry at the IVG's pretension to contribute to the long-term societal and economic outcomes of economically focused guidance, as I thought that it was becoming clearer by the day that even when or if growth returns, there will not necessarily be any more new jobs created. I then succeeded in annoying quite a few councillors present with my admission that I could not rid myself of the nagging feeling that for a very long time, guidance and career counselling have been fair weather friends that could, during the economic boom years, afford to freely go along with any delusional, unrealistic fantasies their clients were entertaining. During those allegedly happier times, the main priority was the optimal allocation of people to occupations. Guidance was based primarily on those so-called matching models that still largely prevail in both vocational guidance and to an even larger extent in the placement of employment seekers today. Such a type of guidance could, however, only function because in those days there were plentiful employment opportunities for people to take up. In the second half of the last century, people in many European countries enjoyed a hitherto unknown degree of upward social mobility. That's us up there. This has led to a substantial increase in the so-called middle class. Ironically, it is above all these relatively new members of the middle class who are now feeling the brunt of the economic crisis. A growing number of individuals in this new middle class realize that they would find it difficult, if not impossible, to get into their current careers if they had to start all over again. On top of that, as parents, they are also increasingly becoming aware that their children might not be as fortunate as they themselves have been. In the Western world, people have become so privileged during the second half of the last century that they have lulled themselves into believing that things would go on forever that way. They forgot that in a democracy, and above all, in a free market economy, a society without losers of some kind is an illusion. And they are only now beginning to realize that while they run the risk of becoming today's losers, their children are in even greater danger of losing out tomorrow. Finally, I did encourage counselors to tell their counselees to avoid the easy, the middle-of-the-road option, for it would be precisely the middle class of middle-skilled and middle-income office clerks and machine operators that would be disappearing fast, never to return to their occupations falling victim to IT and automation. Needless to say that the audience was hardly impressed with what they just heard, and I confess that I was very relieved indeed when none other than Professor Tony Watts came to my rescue. He stressed that being what he called the people business did not mean that a so-called touchy-feely approach was necessarily the best one. As I will not be able to rely on Tony's help today, I hope that what I will say now will go down a wee bit better than my last talk. I will now present you with my thoughts on counseling for the future. The kind of counseling I'm focusing on is career guidance and counseling such as practice in educational and vocational training institutions and in public employment services. And to paraphrase Mark Twain, I believe that the reports of the death of work and subsequently the death of career guidance and counseling, as announced by some academics, have been greatly exaggerated. The world of work has obviously never borne much resemblance to the scene depicted in this glorious painting by Ford Madox Brown. Nevertheless, I am convinced that work can not only provide a roof over your head and food on the table, but it can also give you job satisfaction and grant you personal fulfillment. Work might furthermore offer you a sense of belonging to a community and bind a disparate society closer together. And finally, work might even give meaning to life. So what about the future of work? A lot has been written about work, its future, or the lack thereof, not least by Jeremy Rifkin in his seminal book, The End of Work. By the way, Mr. Rifkin was paid close to €500,000 by the Luxembourg government in 2016 to come up with funny ideas about the third industrial revolution in Luxembourg. He hasn't been back since. But already in 1930, the British economist and founder of modern macroeconomics, John Maynard Keynes, worried in his essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, about what he called a new disease, that is, technological unemployment, due to our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor. You could, of course, disagree with John Maynard Keynes, and you may well have a valid point. But you then most certainly also run the risk of being labeled a Luddite, so named after Ned Ludd and his fellow 19th century textile workers in the United Kingdom, who smashed the machines that had taken over their jobs. Industrialization did indeed not eliminate the need for human intervention, and furthermore, the fact, even today, that an occupation can be automated does not mean at all that it will be. If in developed economies, machines have largely replaced workers in most industrial plants, this does as yet not apply to those industries in the emerging economies, not least because in these countries, labor frequently is still comparatively cheap. In the last few years, the rise of the robots has received much prominence in the media and continues to do so today. But as early as 1920, a science fiction play, now it's going to be interesting, Rozumowi uniwersalni roboti, please pardon my accent, Rossum's Universal Robots, by the Czech author Karel Čapek, introduced the word robot into the English language. RUR begins in a factory that makes artificial people, created out of synthetic organic matter. These roboti are, however, not exactly robots by the current definition of the word, as they may be mistaken for humans and can think for themselves. They seem perfectly happy to work for humans at first, but that changes, and a hostile robot revolution leads to the extinction of the human race. Čapek later took a different approach to the same theme in his 36th novel, War with the Newts, in which non-humans become a servant class in a human society. This, by the way, is the cover of the first edition of the play. Here's a scene from the play showing 3 robots, and here's another one with the robots in rebellion. On the same theme, Kurt Vonnegut, the author of Slaughterhouse-Five, describes in his first novel, Piano Player, a dystopia in which machines have taken over brain as well as manual work. And a giant computer makes all the decisions. Only a few managers and engineers are still employed to tend their new masters. But most people live in homesteads where they spend their time doing make-work jobs. That is both of negative financial benefit and also of no particular interest to the common welfare. Watching television, and I quote, breeding like rabbits. Now, never mind the breeding like rabbits bit, but does it not all sound strangely familiar? If God may not be all that happy with his creation, it now really looks as if man, the creator of the robot, is also beginning to have some serious reservations about his own creation, the robot. These fears are echoes in a number of publications, such as The Race Against the Machine, where you find this quote: There was a type of employee at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution whose job and livelihood largely vanished at the beginning of the 20th century. This was the ... The population of ... actually peaked long after the Industrial Revolution in 1901, when 3.25 million were at work. But the arrival of the internal combustion engine in the late 19th century rapidly displaced these workers, so that by 1924, there were fewer than 2 million. There was always a wage at which these would work and could have remained employed, but that wage was so low that it did not pay. As you may have guessed, this employee was the horse. And we can easily foresee a situation where people, despite being willing and fit to work, have no economic value as employees. And it is above all, as I said already 7 years ago, the middle class of middle-skilled and middle-income employees and workers whose jobs are most at risk. This should get the alarm bells ringing with politicians and policymakers, because the rise of the middle class, a 20th century invention that has been hugely influential and instrumental in bringing about important political and social advances, is not going to go down without a fight. And the potential risks associated with more antagonistic, unstable, and potentially dangerous politics are to be taken very seriously indeed. I won't mention Brexit, Trump, or anybody else. In their second book, The Second Machine Age, the authors repeat the concern that computers and other digital advances are doing for mental power what the steam engine and its descendants did for physical power. In The Rise of the Robots, Martin Ford illustrates how the link between work and productivity had been broken by robots. In 1998, workers in the US business sector put in a total of 194 billion hours of labor. A decade and a half later, in 2013, the value of the goods and services produced by the American businesses had grown by about $3.5 trillion after adjusting for inflation, a 42% increase in output. The total amount of human labor required to accomplish that was 194 billion hours. This means that there was no growth at all in the number of hours worked over this 15-year period, despite the fact that the US population gained over 40 million people during that time. That leads to what Elijah Trojanov has called der überflüssige Mensch, the superfluous man. Here a quote from the book. Most people live in the quicksand between success and redundancy. They are struggling to remain useful, struggling not to crash into the late capitalist rubbish dumps from which there is no salvation. It is about all or nothing. I should, however, point out that there are some critics, such as Robert Gordon of Northwestern University in the States, who reject the comparison between the first industrial revolution and the second machine age as too simplistic. Economist Stuart D. Cole of Deloitte also paint a more balanced picture and think that machines seem no closer to eliminating the need for human labor than at any time in the late 150 years. In my opinion, the most powerful academic paper on this subject has been produced by Carl Benedict Frey and Michael A. Osborne, who estimated the probability of computerization of 702 detailed occupations. They found that 47% of occupational jobs are at risk or at high risk of being automated. Above all, the so-called white-collar occupations, and this over the next decade or so. Here's a selection of occupations and the likelihood that they will be automated within the next 20 years. The jobs with a very low probability of computerizations, such as dentistry, are in green. The other ones with a very high probability, such as accountancy, are in red. And to illustrate how computerization actually works, here's an example. In '68, the job of bridge toll collector had been created at the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. In 2013, the introduction of electronic license plate recognition caused 17 employees to be redeployed or retired, with another 9 losing their jobs. By the way, one of the first academics in the field of career guidance and counseling to raise the issue was none less than Tony Watts, who in his 1983 book, Education, Unemployment, and the Future of Work, looked into various possible futures for work as well as their implications for education and for what was then called orientation, today's career guidance and counseling. So what about counseling for the future? And what should counselors do? The American-Canadian essayist William Gibson said over 20 years ago that the future has already arrived. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet, while I'm very much afraid, the future will not be evenly distributed, full stop. And if so far humans have been able to make good use of whatever robots had to offer, there is no guarantee that this situation is going to persist in the future. Still, there may be some hope, at least as far as some jobs are concerned. Nevertheless, it might be wise to heed John Maynard Keynes' warning that there will be no harm in making mild preparations for our destiny, whatever it may be, because the likelihood that many people will be swept onto the labor scrap heap is unfortunately very real. And this time, technology is going to do to cognitive and non-routine jobs what industrialization did to manual and routine occupations in the 19th century. We should nevertheless remember that elements of hype are an inherent part of futurology. Were we not all supposed to take weekend trips to the moon by this time? And that technology still has a long way to go before we will order our custom-made, personal, lifelike humanoid. We should also take comfort in the fact that not everything that can be automated may actually be automated or accepted. Hence, counselors should encourage their clients to cultivate those skills and competences where humans currently still have a comparative advantage. They should encourage their clients to choose a sector or a job that is not subject to the head-to-head race against the machines, and to focus on so-called soft competences, to specialize in more emotive occupations that are as yet unsuited for machines, such as love counselors, yoga instructors, or artists. In furthermore making sure that their practice is truly transparent, counselors can also contribute to their clients acquiring a realistic outlook to the future. This is of the utmost importance, as never before have so many known so little about so much. As never before have so many refused to believe what they actually do know. Counselors should also remind their clients that they have to be curious, that they have always to stay curious, because curiosity is one of the most important building stones of lifelong learning. There will, of course, still be jobs in the future, but as Tyler Cowen, an economist at George Mason University in the US, stresses in his book, Average is Over, the workforce in the developed economies is likely to be divided into small groups of highly skilled core workers whose expertise will be complementary to that of the machines, and the rest who will be condemned to the peripheral employment treadmill of what the London School of Economics anthropologist David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. As lack of information is no longer a real issue, counselors should ensure that clients acquire the necessary skills to find their way through ever more abundant and ever more complex information. Furthermore, they will have to tune into the decision-making strategies of their clients in order to better accompany them in their decisions. And what should policymakers do? I'm pleased the minister is here. My minister used to be my student. Kurt Vonnegut, I quoted earlier on, said once, the worst thing that could happen to you is you wake up one morning and the guy who used to sit next to you is running the country. Well, it's close. So what should policymakers do? Policymakers should, of course, continue to invest in education, but put a greater emphasis on creativity and personal skills, and promote policies to boost entrepreneurship in order to invent new industries and to create new jobs for humans. Finally, what about the future of counseling? What about the future of our own jobs? Well, according to Fry and Osborne, the occupation of educational, guidance, school, and vocational counselors is ranked 45th out of the 702 jobs they looked into, with a probability of computerization of 0.0088. So our jobs look pretty safe indeed. This does, however, not really come as a surprise, as companies will be vying for talent, and hence counseling in order to attract, to manage, and to retain talent will be of the greatest importance and should safeguard our jobs for the foreseeable future. We should nevertheless not be complacent and look at the broader picture. I am convinced that without profound changes to our lifestyles, to our economic model, and to our social practices, it is unlikely that we, the humans, will outlive the upheavals of the 21st century that has just begun. We should therefore try hard and make the best of the opportunities the machine age will throw at us, and reassess our ways to work and to live for our own good as individuals, but also for the common good of all. This brings me to the end of my presentation And I leave you with this picture showing my wife and myself arguing about what the future holds in store for us. Thank you very much for your attention. Some of you will recognize Hal from Space Odyssey 2001. And please do not hesitate to contact me for further information. Thank you very much.